necessity requirement or necessary requirement is actually interesting, because if you actually go back to the certifications, we're certifying in good faith that that is one of the items that you're certifying, but also right below that, the funds are going to be used to retain workers and maintain payroll, or to make mortgage interest payments, lease payments, utility payments, as specified under the Paycheck Protection Program rules. And then it goes on to say that you understand that if the funds are knowingly used for unauthorized purposes, the federal government may hold me legally liable and charge me for fraud. And so what does this whole pandemic remind us of? The last time this type of economic uncertainty hit the United States was way back in like 2008, when the economy was collapsing, and then they issued the TARP program, right? The infamous Troubled Asset Relief Program, the bailouts. And in the years that followed, there were a wave of enforcement actions, some of which were under the False Claims Act, which is a situation where if you knowingly make a representation to the government for money, and that certification is false, the government can come after you. And that's where these whistleblower lawsuits come from, And so, when we were talking about the Paycheck Protection Program, and then you had mentioned that you would help folks get signed up for this. And so I think the theme of the show for today is, what should companies be thinking about in real time now, like today, when they're requesting money from the government? And oh, by the way, it looks like there's going to be audits of loans above 2 million. So even if you don't think you're going to get popped for a potential FCA key tam, or even just an enforcement action directly from the DOJ, that audit process is happening. So what should companies be thinking about as they're making these certifications? Should they be going back and reviewing everything they've written and then making a contemporaneous file as to why they believe it's necessary? And how should they go about allocating, if they're making a certification that says, I'm going to use it for payroll and I'm going to use it for mortgage and lease and utility, what in your experience, Jenny, should companies be thinking about right now in terms of creating a paper trail, just in case 5 years down the road, for example, a DOJ, comes knocking on your door, or maybe an employee left and says, hey, I think that you erroneously took PPP funds. And now you've got a situation where maybe the folks in your company have gone, they've new job, maybe they're in a different state. And so now you're beholden to like the contemporaneous files that you've done today for something that might happen 5 years from now. And so with that, bring it over to Jenny, and maybe if you want to give the audience here a brief intro into your background, and then sort of launch into that and why it's so important that these companies, large and small, take extra steps to make sure that they're creating a record for how they're actually spending these funds, notwithstanding the fact that they truly have a necessary need for them.
Well, Josh, thanks for having me on to talk about this. My specialty is financial logistics for federal contractors, and I work with small businesses all the time to make sure that they have the information to be competitive and to comply with all the rules, because it's one thing to get into government contracting, it's another thing to know how to play the game and make sure that you've got that you need to have. So I've helped a couple of people with the completion of the documentation to apply for the loan. And actually, we had to scratch our heads and do some thinking together to figure out how to even answer the question. So it's not a straightforward thing. But essentially, we had to estimate what a year's worth of payroll was, chunk that out, and say what an 8-week period of that would be. And I think we multiplied it by 2.5 to come up with how much eligible funds they would have that they could apply for. Different banks have different software setups to put that information in. So everybody seemed to have a different way they were responding to the questions. But once we did figure it out, we were very careful about making sure that we were keeping track as we went of the emails back and forth, the conversations that they were having with the bankers, who some of the bankers were in on a Sunday, and we were texting them to ask certain questions. And so we were making sure that we were keeping track of all of those emails. I also created spreadsheets, and in the creation of the spreadsheets, we were allowed to upload 15 documents, and they all had to be PDFs in the case of the bank we were working with. So I had a spreadsheet that had 4 or 5 tabs on it for here's our payroll. I had to tie it to the quarterly tax returns, and they're not tax returns, their payroll tax reports, and they're normally called the 941 quarterly payroll tax report, which you add up the 4 quarters of the 941, and that should equal to your W-2s at the end of the year. So we actually had to take the last 3 quarters of 2019 and the first quarter of 2020. All of these things took some figuring out to do, and somebody that's not familiar with accounting and does as much payroll support type stuff as I do might not know that answer, but we got it all in there. We hit the button, we got the go button, and I'm still waiting to hear if they all get the money back, get approved for the loan, because they submitted to be part of the first set, and that first set of money just whooshed. It went away so quickly.
Fast. Oh
yeah.
my goodness.
It really did. I believe there was $50 million spent by the state of Florida, and they identified how many loans that was. I think there were 1,000 loans approved under that, which makes it seem like that was a bunch of small businesses. But I was really disappointed by what I call the PPP bandits, those that applied, but really, in my opinion, whether they legally could do it or not, my thought was, is it socially responsible when we're all in this together? Why are some of these companies going after that money? And that's really what I've been talking to people about. Anyway, to me, the question is, did a CEO and a CFO of a publicly held business that still qualifies under what you and I consider the NAICS codes for small business, sign up for a loan that they could have gotten just because they said, well, somebody else is getting a 1% loan, we're getting a 1% loan. Somebody even called me out and said, well, if they don't apply for it, their shareholders could sue them. And I'm like, we can't run everything that way. But back to your original question, what kind of documentation do they need to keep? I would keep all the documentation in the preparation submittal of the loan. We have the 15 or so documents that we uploaded. So it was every quarter's payroll tax report, every quarter's report that I call the employee payroll document. We chose the last payroll check of the quarter each time. And there's normally on those reports a quarter to date and a year to date amount for the employees. In our case, we didn't have the year to date, the quarter to date, so we had to subtract to get the year to date. We also identified those employees that made over $100,000 a year, because there's a provision called mandatory exclusion to pull those out. It didn't include payroll taxes. It was just their gross pay. So their regular pay, salaried, holiday. We chose to exclude bonuses. Some people would include those because you could argue that's part of regular compensation. But what I said to them is, let's do the most simplest, the most straightforward, so that we know we can back this up to the penny, and that we're doing it right, and we're doing it ethically and in a social responsible way. And that's exactly what we did.
It sounds like there's a lot of, it sounds like what you guys were, the path that you took, your clients on was document laden. Let's get everything we can on paper. Let's create a paper trail. Let's, explain why we're doing specific things. Here's all of our entire package with all of our attached files, and then keep those files, and to be able to show someone down the road. Is there anything that folks should be thinking about when they're expending money for their mortgage or their lease or their utility? Because if we go back to what at least from what the certification on SBA form 2483 says, it says, they're going to only use this for certain workers and to maintain payroll or to make mortgage interest payments, lease payments, and utility payments as specified under the Paycheck Protection Program rule. Are they, you just having folks, just keep track of everything that you're paying outside of the paychecks, because it might be a little bit easier with an accounting system, but at least a document, because it sounds like that. And even though you're allowed to go over it, there's another certification even below that's worthy of paying attention to, and it says that that for loan forgiveness. So you're certifying one more thing in good faith. I understand that loan forgiveness will be provided for the sum of documented payroll costs. There's that word, documented. Covered mortgage interest payments. So we got these mortgage interest payments that are covered. Covered rent payments and covered utilities and not more than 25% of the forgiven amount may be for non-payroll costs, right? So there's some limitations here on how to get the forgivable portion of your loan back, or just so that you're not having to pay it back. So there's a lot of little things that folks need to be thinking about, because as we mentioned, SBA is sort of rapidly, moving forward. They're creating these FAQs and guidance. We'll be seeing things come most likely out of the Federal Register as rules or interim rules. And now we're in a situation where, okay, we don't want to be the person or the company that's taking advantage of a lot of chaos and uncertainty, because we still need to make sure that even though we're uncertain as to what's going on, as more information comes out, we want to be in a position where we're taking our best steps to document the reasons and where the money is going and how we're allocating it. Because God forbid any type of enforcement action coming down the road, whether it's from a relator through a KETAM enforcement action or not, you've got a situation where, like I said, folks have moved on, changed companies, different states, you no longer can get a hold of them. You're really only going to be left with, this is what we did. And if you don't have a paper trail, then it's going to be a lot harder to show that you were thinking about these issues as they were coming up.
That's a really good point. And when they wrote that, what we've interpreted that to mean is that 75% should be for payroll cost. Most of the banks are advising their companies that they're working with on what to do, but they're asking questions as well. And you can't really get through to the SBA, so looking online it will help. But in the end, I believe that companies should be working with their bankers and figuring out what would be the right way to go. So the one that I have worked with that has received the funding, what we determined is that he should set up a separate bank account inside his accounting system. And so what we did is we said, here's the bank account, here's the authorized loan amount. And anytime there's a transaction or transfer related to that, we're keeping track of it. So I said, just like anything else, let's make sure that any transaction coming out of that new checking account, which we chose to call PPP checking, we want to have it just so that we could reconcile that bank account just like any other bank account. I've told them to set up new charge numbers if they were doing anything different or specific. But the other thing we did is he said, well, I had to call and get them to transfer money for payroll. That doesn't come out of the check the same way. And so we said, well, that would be a bank transfer. So let's make sure we record the bank transfer the same way we record all other bank transfers and document it. And a lot of our accounting systems now have a place that you can upload documents or some kind of backup. I definitely said, put something on your server, put all these documents on your server, maybe create a zip file every time you got something large. And I always give them the whole paper thing. I say, well, let's get a binder, let's put a label on it, let's stick it on the shelf. And even though I know that younger people don't like to kill trees, I'm a tree killer. I want every single document. And I had 2.5 inches of documentation just on one company's loan package. And that it was a pretty small company. So, and that's just the stuff that I am keeping, the accounting records. So you can know that this is going to be very specific. The other thing is the money has to be spent fairly quickly. And so a lot of these companies that have biweekly payroll will be able to spend it over 6 weeks or something like that. But what I recommended to them is let's spend the money on payroll first. So we're showing if we had an entire loan amount and we spent it all on payroll, that would be good. A lot of them don't have interest expense or mortgage interest, or if they have rent expense. What the government is trying to do is say, do not default on a loan, and make sure that your rent is kept up to date so you're not getting into these worse problems. But the main thing I did is my personal expectation is I should be able to say, here is the expense, here's the documentation of the invoice or whatever it was that we used that we would normally have in an accounting record. Here's the check or electronic transfer coming out of the bank account that we have. I want it to be precise to the day, and I want to have the right approvals on it, just like anything else. But I believe that you're absolutely right. They're going to be coming back 5 years from now and ask people what happened. And I also believe that there'll be some of the contract activity, especially where a small business or has asked for some kind of special information or whatever of a contracting officer, they're going to want to document those type of things too.
That makes sense. I mean, it sounds like everything we're talking about now is stuff and is really centered around compliance. And it just goes to show that, like, if you're a small or mid-sized company and this is somewhat foreign to you, it could just be, even if you're not anticipating taking any PPP money, you know, some of the themes that we're talking about, just in terms of accurate, obviously, if you have an accounting system, there's probably an online database, or the software keeps track of items. But for good business practice, you know, having sort of methodologies in place to help, you know, cover situations like this. And you know, this may or may not be the last pandemic we see, but if you're in a situation where you're a business in an area that is impacted by a hurricane, for example, or some other natural occurring event that throws a wrench into how your company is doing business, whether you're you know, doing business with the federal government and you're getting maybe stop work orders or changes and things like that. I mean, we've just talked about the PPP, but we haven't really gone on beyond that in the government contracting space for folks who are getting these you know, suspension of work notices, or just, you know, delay. The DoD sent out these memorandum saying, hey, look, pay them if you can. You know, I've talked to some folks that have business with the DoD, and it's a mixed bag. Some contractors are like, yeah, I know, but I'm not spending the money. I don't want. Contracting officers are saying they don't want to spend the money, even though the directive from the top is basically like, do everything you can to help them. But they've got their own budgets and they can exercise their independent judgment in making these decisions. So you have some contractors who are just getting paid to have their employees just sit on the sideline because they're not able to, whether not go on base or something like that. But so it's impacting different sectors within the government contracting space and then outside of the government contracting space in different ways. And when we talk about a global pandemic or the COVID-19 pandemic, you know, we put an analogy to the troubled asset, the TARP program, troubled asset relief program. But then you also have, like I said, you know, if you're in an area that's impacted by a natural disaster, has that impact your contracting? It all comes down to being able to document and record and keep a trail that's, you know, auditable. Because if you're one of those unfortunate companies that is subject to this audit or faces a lawsuit under the FCA, you want to be in the best position to be able to say, no, I did everything by the book. Here's what I did. Here's my thinking. This is why I believed it was necessary for me to take the money. Here's how here's my loan application. Here's this separate designated bank account that we kept, and it shows all the transactions for payments to employees, for payroll. And here's the 3 or 4 times we made a utility payment or a lease or a rent payment or whatever. And that's going to look favorable because, you know, compliance is about trying to do your best efforts. The folks that are going to get hit are the ones that are being evasive, you know.